is a property of color. It refers to the lightness and darkness of a color. So here's an interesting chart that shows all the colors of the white light spectrum and how they fall naturally from light to dark on a value spectrum. So in other words, blue is naturally darker than red, but red is naturally darker than orange. That information can help an artist choose what colors to use in an artwork when working from a value plan. So maybe an artist would use the color green to represent a middle value and red to represent a dark value. Now that being said, look at what this chart also shows. It also shows that any color can be lightened or darkened. And that's really what we mean when we say that value is the lightness and darkness of a color. So orange can be represented in a darker orange or a lighter orange. And the same for blue or for green. Let's take a look at how artists do that in artwork. Whether an artist is attempting to use value to imply form, so making this apple look three-dimensional, or in this case apply some form to the subject's body, or maybe to this bear, or whether an artist is simply using value to differentiate one shape from another. So here the space around the deep sea diver is darker than the deep sea diver, and therefore an outline around the deep sea diver is not needed because we have contrast and value. So whether an artist is trying to do that, or here's another example of using values, but simple values. So what I mean is, look, here's the reference photo, and we see just three values: dark, middle, light, following gray. Dark, middle, and light. And then here's the painting that goes with it. So this was done in watercolor, and so this student did a great job of blending colors to create really interesting hues. But we still see those three values being represented: dark, middle, and light, which adds visual complexity and also describes some form. So it's helping to communicate to the viewer exactly what the subject is. Here's a little study all done in one color, but again we see a wide range in value where the artist has manipulated the color to create different values in just one color. Okay, so regardless of how value is being used, it's really important that the artist understands how to change the value in the particular medium they're working with. And so I just wanted to quickly go over how you would change value in a variety of media, so that you could go from something like that to something like this, where you're starting to add some value to increase visual complexity and maybe even model form. Pen and ink is similar, I'll just use this Sharpie, is similar to marker or watercolor or colored pencil or graphite, in that the whiteness of the paper is used to create light values. So for instance, if it's pen and ink, then if I want to differentiate one shape from another, and this is my mark making, hatching, then I simply have to cover up more of the white of the paper in a certain part of my artwork to create a darker value. So now I'll use the same form of mark making in this shape, and what I'm trying to do is make this smaller shape appear as though it's behind the shape in the front, so I'm making it darker. But the point is that I made it darker by adding more ink to the paper. So it would be the same if I use graphite. So maybe I would lay down a value in that shape, and then I lay down the same value in this shape, but I need to darken this value if I want to differentiate the two without relying on the outline that I initially drew the shapes with. So sometimes artists don't want to rely on outline, so they just instead use contrast and value. And it really, I mean, I want to really stress that we're still talking about color here. It's just that this color is gray, this color is black, and to an artist we can consider those to be colors. I know that they're not colors from the white light spectrum. But look, here's a color. This is Tuscan red. So it's the same thing. If I give these two shapes the same value, then there's really very little differentiation. But if I immediately start to darken this shape, the smaller one, then we see a differentiation. So that's what we mean by differentiating shape with value contrast. As opposed to doing something like this where we're using slow changes in value to model form. So in that case, maybe I would do something like this. So here's my sphere, and I'm thinking as a painter, I'm going to lay down one color, green, and then I'm going to build another color on top of it. So I'm going to go on top of the green with this sienna brown. But this time, I'm actually going to utilize a change in value by controlling the pressure that I place on this medium, which is colored pencil. So you're going to have a lot of art projects where you can choose the medium that you want to use, and that's why in this short video I just want to quickly remind you or show you how to change value with different media. So right now I'm just controlling the pressure that I put on the pencil, the colored pencil, to create darker values on the outside of the sphere. But remember, you don't want to super saturate the paper, the tooth of the paper, with the colored pencil. So I'm going to get to a point where just pressing harder isn't enough. I have to use the color that darkens all other colors, black. And so now as I carefully put a layer of black into my sienna brown, I can see that I'm achieving a darker value and my sphere is starting to take form. So I'm turning this flat two-dimensional circle into, I'm going to go back with the brown now, into a sphere, as I was saying. So this is very common for what colored pencil artists, common way for them to work. They have a mitt full of colored pencils and they just layer. So I'm constantly working back and forth from my dark black to darken the value of my brown to the brown, back and forth, maybe even add a little bit more red in there. Okay, now if it was marker, it'd be the same thing. Like some markers already come in a variety of values. So like for instance, I kind of consider these all to be similar in color, not that one, sorry. And this one's the lightest. So maybe I use this, say I have like some different shapes that I want to differentiate here. So I'm going to use this color because it has this particular lighter value for that shape, but then I'm going to use this one for this shape because I noticed that it has a bit of a darker value, and I'm going to go right into my third shape with it, except that now those two shapes that are the same peachy color are not really differentiated. So no problem, I'll just use this third color to layer on top of the peach. So if you're using marker, I really encourage you to experiment with layering, blending the markers, layering colors. And it works especially well if you're using faded markers. Okay, so there's 3 different shapes and they're all differentiated by 3 different values. And so I don't need to rely on outlines. Differentiating shape with value contrast is what I was illustrating with the scuba diver. So the scuba diver was drawn with a variety of shapes. And in this example here, I'm actually using slow changes in value, gradations, to make objects look 3-dimensional. So if I want this to look like a cylinder, I'm going to use darker values on the 2 edges and then lighter values down the center of the shape of the rectangle to make it look like a cylinder. So that's starting to take shape there. But in this version, I wasn't worried about modeling form. I just wanted to use changes in value to differentiate one shape from another. So I wanted to differentiate the back leg from the front leg. So I used a darker value in the back leg. Or I wanted to differentiate the flipper from the leg. So I used a darker value on the flipper. Or here, differentiating the torso from the arm. So I used a darker value on the arm. So that's what I was trying to illustrate here, and why I'm stressing the importance of being able to work in a wide range of values so that you can differentiate shapes. But it's not just about differentiating shapes, it's also about adding maturity and visual complexity to your artwork. How about watercolor? Watercolor is similar to ink, marker, and graphite in that we don't use white watercolor, we use the whiteness of the paper to create lighter values. So if I want to create a really light valued red, there it is. Sorry, let me move that in the camera. So there's my light value red. I'm using lots of water, very little pigment. So a lot of the whiteness of the paper is showing through. However, if I'm a little bit more aggressive or I use more pigment, then I'm going to create a darker value. But remember, if you're using watercolor, the pigment should always be translucent on the paper. So in other words, we never ever want to super saturate the paper with like really thick layers of watercolor paint. How do you get a darker color then? Well, you have to, like with the color pencil, use the color that darkens all other colors. So we want to use black. So in my palette, I can add a little bit of black, mix in a little bit of red. So basically what I'm doing is I'm making a dark red, and then I can paint with that. And that's how I'm going to achieve my dark values in watercolor, by mixing black into my colors, rather than putting too many layers of color on the paper. So what we're trying to avoid is working too opaquely with watercolor. The watercolor should always remain translucent on the paper. This isn't too bad. This would be acceptable, but once that dries, if I was to keep adding more and more of that same value of red on top, what I'm trying to say is I'm not necessarily making it any darker red, I'm just making it more opaque, and we want to avoid that with watercolor. Now, how about acrylic paint? Acrylic paint works a little bit different. Acrylic paint can be used in an opaque manner. It's quite versatile because it can also be used translucently, but it's often used in an opaque manner. And so with acrylic paint, of course, there's so many different ways to go about using acrylic paint, but just generally speaking, just think of it as a paint that does require you, the artist, to manipulate the value in the palette. So like for instance, here's a particular value of blue-green that's right out of the tube, but if I want it to be a lighter value, well then I simply have to add white to it, and the more white I add, the lighter the value will get, right? And so based on the value needs of my artwork, or maybe my value plan, I would create the particular value of blue-green. Sometimes I could even add white right on the paper and create value gradations right on the paper. Other times I would again mix the value in my palette before applying it to the... Okay, and then of course we know that the opposite of white would be black. So white is the color that we use to tint, and black is the color that we use to shade. So in my palette, if I add a tiny bit of black to this blue-green, you don't need much black because it's pretty powerful. Well, now I have a dark version or a darker value of blue-green, and then I could paint with that in order to, well, do whatever I want to do. Differentiate shape, or maybe model form like I was trying to do in this one here. Model some form. Okay, so that's a really quick explanation on changing values of colors in a variety of media. And value is a property of color. So when we're working with color, we're automatically already working with value. So just make sure you're always thinking about value, using a wide range of value, and it's going to make your artwork look even more special and more dynamic than it already is.